Hi, this lecture considers the question, what is human nature? It begins a series of lectures that will consider that question and consider various challenges to Confucianism and how some Confucians respond in different ways to that challenge. When we entertain this question, what is human nature, we need to keep in mind that there's a distinctive understanding of the concept nature within Chinese philosophy. So in one of the classical Chinese texts, the Doctrine of the Mean, there's the explanation of nature as follows. Quote, what is mandated by heaven is called one's nature. To follow one's nature is called the way. There are several components of this explanation of what nature means, several components that could be examined a little bit further. In the next slide, I'll explain a little bit that notion of the way, but here I'll just highlight the notion of heaven. So it's a notion that maybe shouldn't be translated as heaven, it's Tian. It has many different meanings, and it depends on the author and view. So it's sort of just some sort of higher power. It's not really a place that you go after you die. It's sort of the higher power that governs how the universe is and will be. So that's the primary meaning. It's this sort of higher power. Now it is, in fact, a place where various ancestors reside, so if they've died, that's where they go after their birth, but it's sort of much more than that, and really the emphasis here, when you say what is mandated by heaven, heaven is doing something, it's not just a place. So why is that notion of heaven important? Well, it's important because it is what gives us our nature. So we're given this nature, and it's not up to our control to have a particular nature, we're given it. Now, what exactly heaven has given us is going to be answered differently by different Chinese philosophers. But before getting into that and seeing one particular view of human nature, I need to say a little bit about the concept of way. So the concept of the way is the one that's crucial to Taoism. So the notion way, the Chinese term there is Tao. But it's a notion that Confucians also accept. They place a great emphasis on it as well. So it's not something that's unique to Taoism. I'm going to be presenting now kind of how the Confucians understand this notion of the way, and primarily it has two different roles. On the one hand, it has a certain metaphysical role. What does that mean? Well, it means that the way is the correct way of explaining the fundamental metaphysical features of how the world is. So if you want to explain what is the cosmos like, what are the various laws that govern it, not just physical laws, but other sorts of kind of more fundamental laws for how the world is, the way explains it. But that's the metaphysical role for this notion of the way. There's also the ethical role. And that can be explained as the correct path for how the world should be. So what's distinctive here about this notion of the way is that it's a thick term, what a philosopher would call a thick term, not thin, meaning it has kind of this multi-layered meaning. So it's the correct explanation of what something is, as well as how something should be. In other words, it's simultaneously descriptive and normative. It simultaneously tells you how things are and tells you how things should be. Now, as I've noted, Confucians adopt this notion of the way and think that human nature is dictated by the way, as well as what human nature should be used for, how we should react to having the nature we do, is also dictated by the way. But what happens in Chinese philosophy is that there are challengers to Confucianism that use this notion of the way and use the notion of nature, of human nature, to argue against Confucianism. And so that's what we'll turn to now. The primary challenger to Confucianism here is a philosopher named Yang Zhu. Now, unfortunately, we do not have Yang's own text. We just have sort of reports about what he believed. We have what various Confucians said in response to him and named him and so on. But the basic idea there is that Yang had was that human nature is fundamentally selfish. And we should also embrace that. Now, the second challenger to Confucianism here that's somewhat similar comes from Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi is one of the philosophers associated with Taoism, but there are many different passages in Zhuangzi's text, and one of them is Robber Xi. And Robber Xi is a person that seems to embrace something like what Yang does, so seems to embrace the idea that we should act selfishly. Now, what I'll do in the rest of this lecture is explain some of the ideas that are associated with these challenges. Associated with Yangism in Robert Xi, we can label as an egoistic challenge. The idea that we ought to, and that we do, act fundamentally for ourselves selfishly. Yang's challenge to Confucianism, as well as to Moism, but we're focusing on Confucianism primarily, his challenge there begins with identifying an assumption that the Confucians hold, and he's going to use that assumption against them. What is that assumption? Well, it's that we should act in accordance with human nature, that we should act in accordance with what heaven has mandated, in accordance with the way. But he's going to depart from the Confucians as well as the Mohists by saying that human nature is fundamentally self-interested. So this is just a descriptive claim about what people's psychological motivations, deep down, what they really are like. They're ultimately selfish. That when a person acts, they're ultimately acting on desires that are selfish desires. Even if that behavior might seem altruistic, it's really done for selfish reasons. Notice that the first claim I have here, that we should act in accordance with human nature, is a prescriptive claim. It says what we ought or should do. Whereas the second claim is a descriptive claim, just says what we are in fact like. But we put those two together, we can infer another prescriptive claim, which is that everyone should act only for their own self-interest. Because that's what human nature is, and it's what we should do. And he's basically saying, yes, Confucians, you're right, we need to do what human nature dictates, but human nature dictates something different than what you think, so we should act selfishly. Now, the Confucians are going to say a lot about acting for the sake of others, and the Mohists too. The Mohists go even further and say that we should never act partially, that we should act impartially, not have preferences for family and friends. And so what Yang does is say that the Confucians or Mohists are wrong because they have this incorrect view of human nature. They're wrong about what ethics demands because they're wrong about this more deep issue, the question about what human nature is. I've been presenting things in terms of what Yang says, but I can quote Robert Xi here as well. He says, quote, the way of yours being the Confucians, this way of yours is a crazy, fraudulent, vain, empty, and artificial business. It is no way to fulfill your true self. End quote. So he's basically saying the true self is selfish, and you ought to follow what the true self is. I'll now conclude this lecture by drawing a distinction between two different views, two different forms of egoism, which are adopted by Yang. He adopts both of them, but other philosophers might accept only one or the other, or maybe neither. Now, the distinction is between two different forms of egoism, where egoism is a philosophical view. Now, psychological egoism is the philosophical view that we are fundamentally selfish. So it's a merely descriptive view about what we in fact are like. It's a descriptive view about what actually motivates us, what our desires are like. It's not a view about what we should do. That's ethical egoism. Ethical egoism is the view that we ought to be selfish. So it's prescriptive doctrine. And so that prescriptive doctrine is in fact embraced by Yang. We saw that he argued that we should be selfish. Robert Xi makes that point very forcefully. And you can identify many other thinkers throughout history that have adopted this prescriptive view that we ought to act selfishly. Someone like Ayn Rand. Of course, other philosophers would say ethical egoism, well, that's kind of a contradiction in terms. That's an oxymoron, because to be ethical isn't to be self-centered. But nevertheless, some philosophers do argue that that is the true ethical view. So that one has some support among philosophers. Ethical egoism is adopted by some philosophers. Psychological egoism, on the other hand, is very rarely adopted by philosophers. We see that Yang and Robert G hold that view, saying that we act ultimately selfishly, but other philosophers reject this. And there's also at least one philosopher in the Western tradition that adopts this view, Thomas Hobbes. But these are minority views in both the Western and Eastern traditions. In the next lecture, I'll focus on some of the reasons why philosophers reject psychological egoism. And I'll focus particularly on the philosopher Mengzi or Mencius.